I never thought I'd be recording this message at 3 a.m., my hands shaking so violently I can barely hold my phone steady, but I need you to know what my own son has been doing to me for the past 8 months. My name is Margaret Caldwell. I'm 72 years old, and until 3 nights ago, I believed I was losing my mind to Alzheimer's disease. But I just discovered the most horrifying, soul-crushing truth that will make your blood run cold and change how you view family forever. 3 nights ago, I pretended to take my evening medication like I had every single night for months. Instead, I hid the pill under my tongue and waited in my bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake the dead. What I witnessed while pretending to sleep, what I saw my own flesh and blood doing to me while he thought I was unconscious, will haunt me until my dying day, and it should terrify every parent watching this. I'm talking about systematic drugging, financial theft, forged documents, and a plan so sinister, so carefully orchestrated, that it makes Hollywood thrillers look like children's bedtime stories. This isn't fiction. This is what happened to me. And if you have elderly parents or relatives, this could be happening in your family right now. My voice is shaking because I'm still in shock. I'm still struggling to accept that the baby I carried for 9 months, the child I rocked through countless nightmares, the son I defended and supported through every failure and triumph, spent 8 months methodically destroying my mind and planning to lock me away forever so he could steal everything I had worked my entire life to build. First CTA, please subscribe. Before I tell you what happened that night, please hit that subscribe button and the bell icon. This story could save someone you love, and I need as many people as possible to hear this warning. Emotional Minita. Before I continue with what I saw, I need you to understand how I got here, because this didn't happen overnight. This was a carefully orchestrated plan that took months to execute. And if you have elderly parents or relatives, you need to watch for the signs I'm about to share with you. Flashback to the past. 2 years ago, my life was completely different, and I need you to understand exactly how perfect everything was before my son destroyed it, because the contrast will show you just how calculated and cruel his actions truly were. I lived alone in the Victorian house my late husband James had restored for us 43 years ago, pouring his heart and soul into every room until it became our sanctuary from the world. Every morning, I'd wake up to the sound of cardinals singing in the massive oak tree outside my bedroom window, the same tree where our children had built a treehouse that still stands today, weathered but sturdy, like a monument to happier times. The house smelled perpetually of lavender sachets I kept in every drawer, vanilla candles I lit religiously every evening while reading, and the faint aroma of James's pipe tobacco that somehow still lingered in the walls of his study, even 6 years after his death. My bedroom was my favorite room, painted a soft sage green that James had picked because he said it brought out the color of my eyes. The morning light would filter through white lace curtains my mother had given me as a wedding gift, creating dancing shadows on the hardwood floors James had refinished himself during our 2nd year of marriage. I had a routine that was pure joy. I'd wake up naturally around 6 a.m., make a pot of strong coffee in the kitchen where James had installed custom cabinets to accommodate my height, and sit at our breakfast nook reading the newspaper while watching the neighborhood wake up. I was independent, sharp as a tack, and proud of it in a way that only someone who had lived through 7 decades could understand. I balanced my own checkbook down to the penny every month, drove myself to Hartman's Grocery every Tuesday and Friday at exactly 10 a.m. when the store was quiet, and Mr. Hartman would personally help me carry my groceries to the car, and tended to my rose garden that had won 3 county fair ribbons for Most Beautiful Residential Display in 2018, 2019, and 2020. My rose garden was my masterpiece, my connection to the earth and to James's memory. 27 bushes of different varieties, red climbing roses on the pergola James built, white tea roses along the front walkway, pink David Austin roses in the back corner where we'd scattered some of James's ashes. I knew every bush intimately, which ones needed more water, which ones were prone to black spot, which ones bloomed earliest in spring and latest in fall. My hands were always stained with soil during growing season, and I wore that badge with pride. My mind was clear as crystal, sharper than most people half my age. I could recite phone numbers I'd memorized 40 years ago without hesitation, remember birthdays and anniversaries without writing them down, and solve the daily crossword puzzle in pen, not pencil, pen, usually within 30 minutes while drinking my second cup of coffee. I read voraciously, finishing 2 or 3 novels a week, everything from literary fiction to mystery to historical biographies. James used to joke that I had a computer for a brain, and even after he passed, I continued to challenge myself intellectually every single day. I volunteered at the Millfield Public Library every Thursday afternoon from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m., helping elderly patrons navigate the computer system and reading to children during story time. The children called me Miss Maggie, and their faces would light up when I arrived carrying my special bag of props and voices for different characters. I had been volunteering there for 12 years, and Mrs. Peterson, the head librarian, always said I was the most reliable volunteer they'd ever had. My social life was rich and fulfilling. I had coffee with my neighbor Eleanor every Monday morning, attended book club every second Wednesday at the community center, played bridge every Saturday afternoon with 3 other widows who had become like sisters to me. We called ourselves the Magnificent Four, and we had been playing together for 8 years, keeping detailed scores and awarding a small trophy each month to the winner. I held my own in these games, my mind sharp enough to remember every card played and calculate odds in my head. But my relationship with my son David had always been complicated, a source of anxiety that I carried in my chest like a persistent ache. He was my only child, born when I was 28, after years of heartbreaking miscarriages and fertility treatments that nearly broke both James and me emotionally and financially. When David finally arrived, healthy and perfect, we thought our prayers had been answered. Perhaps that was our first mistake. We thought David was a miracle, and we treated him like one. James and I poured everything into raising him, perhaps too much, perhaps not enough. I still don't know. We paid for his education at Princeton, where he studied business and economics while developing what I now recognize were the skills he would later use to manipulate and deceive. We supported him through 2 failed business ventures, a restaurant that closed within 6 months because David had no understanding of customer service, and a consulting firm that folded when clients discovered he was billing them for work he never completed. We even helped with the down payment on his house when he married Sarah 15 years ago, a beautiful colonial in Westbrook that was far beyond what they could afford on their combined salaries. David always had champagne tastes and a beer budget, but somehow he always convinced others to fund his dreams. But David had always been calculating, manipulative in ways that made my stomach turn even when he was small. Even as a child, he would orchestrate elaborate campaigns to get what he wanted. When he wanted a new bicycle, he would suddenly become the perfect son for weeks, helping with chores without being asked, being extra affectionate, bringing me flowers from Mrs. Henderson's garden that he'd picked without permission. He would do my dishes, vacuum the living room, even attempt to cook dinner, all while watching me carefully to gauge whether his performance was having the desired effect. The moment he got what he wanted, the bicycle, the video game, permission to attend a sleepover, he would return to his usual distant, sometimes cruel self. The transformation was so sudden and complete that it felt like living with 2 different children. The loving, helpful David would disappear overnight, replaced by a cold stranger who seemed to view James and me as obstacles to his personal satisfaction. As a teenager, David perfected the art of emotional manipulation. He learned exactly which buttons to push to make me feel guilty, how to make James doubt his own parenting, how to play us against each other when he wanted something we had initially refused. He was particularly skilled at making me feel like I was failing as a mother if I didn't give him whatever he was demanding. "Mom, you're the only person who really understands me," he would say when he wanted money for some expensive item. "Dad doesn't get it, but you do. You've always been the one who believed in me." And I would melt, reaching for my checkbook while James shook his head in frustration. David understood that I was vulnerable to the idea that I might be letting him down, and he exploited that vulnerability ruthlessly throughout his childhood and adolescence. As an adult, David visited sporadically, usually when he needed something significant. Money for Sarah's medical bills when she was diagnosed with lupus, and their insurance refused to cover her treatments. A loan to keep his latest consulting business afloat when clients started demanding refunds for incomplete work. Help with legal fees when he was sued by a former client who claimed David had misrepresented his qualifications and experience. I gave him everything he asked for because he was my son, my only family after James passed away from a massive heart attack 6 years ago. James had been working in his garden, planting new bulbs for spring, when he collapsed next to his beloved tulip bed. I found him there an hour later when I came outside to call him for lunch, his hands still clutching a small garden spade, dirt under his fingernails, a peaceful expression on his face, like he had simply decided to take a nap among his flowers. After James's death, David became more attentive for a few months, calling regularly and visiting to check on me. I was so grateful for his presence during that dark time that I didn't recognize the calculating gleam in his eyes as he evaluated my house, my possessions, and my emotional vulnerability. I thought my son was finally maturing, finally understanding the importance of family. I had no idea he was conducting reconnaissance for the systematic destruction of my life. Sarah was different from David in every way that mattered. She was kind, genuine, and possessed an empathy that seemed completely foreign to her husband. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes from dealing with David's constant schemes and financial irresponsibility, the way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was looking. She worked as a nurse at Millfield General Hospital, pulling long shifts to help support their household, while David pursued his various business opportunities that never seemed to generate steady income. Sarah would visit me separately sometimes, bringing homemade chicken soup when I had a cold, or sitting with me during thunderstorms, because she somehow knew I'd been afraid of them since childhood, when a lightning strike had destroyed our neighbor's barn and killed 2 horses. She never asked for anything during these visits, never seemed to have an agenda beyond genuine concern for my well-being. My daughter-in-law would often look like she wanted to tell me something important, but would stop herself, glancing around nervously as if she were afraid someone might overhear. There was always a sadness in her eyes, a defeated quality that reminded me of abused animals I'd seen at the animal shelter where I used to volunteer. She was carrying a burden she couldn't share, and I often wondered if David was as manipulative and cruel to her as he had been to James and me. I noticed how David would cut Sarah off when she started talking about their finances or future plans, how he would change the subject whenever she mentioned her concern about my living alone, or her suggestion that they should spend more time helping me maintain the house and garden. His interruptions weren't gentle redirects. They were sharp, authoritative commands that made Sarah flinch and fall silent immediately. "Sarah doesn't understand the big picture," David would say after shutting down one of her comments. "She worries too much about things that aren't her concern." But Sarah's concerns were always reasonable, always rooted in genuine care. She worried about me driving at night as I got older, about the way David seemed to be making financial decisions without consulting me, about the gradual isolation that was creeping into my life as David discouraged me from maintaining my social connections. Looking back now, I realize that Sarah was trying to protect me from her husband, and David was working overtime to prevent her from interfering with his plans. The tension between them during family visits wasn't marital discord. It was the conflict between a predator and someone trying to stop him from claiming his victim. I wish I had listened more carefully to the things Sarah wasn't saying, the warnings she was trying to give me through worried glances and half-finished sentences. She saw what David was becoming, what he was planning, but she was trapped in her own web of manipulation and fear, powerless to save either of us from the man we both loved and feared. Early signs of lies and secrets. The changes started so subtly, so gradually, that I didn't recognize them as warning signs until it was almost too late. Looking back now, I can see that David's plan was masterfully orchestrated, designed to make me doubt my own sanity so slowly that each individual incident seemed plausible, even reasonable. It began 13 months ago on a crisp October morning when David started visiting more frequently. This should have made me happy. What mother doesn't want to see more of her only child? But instead, each unannounced visit left me feeling increasingly uneasy, like a deer sensing a predator in the forest, but unable to identify the source of danger. He would arrive without calling, letting himself in with the spare key I'd given him years ago for emergencies. I would be in my garden, wearing my old gardening dress with the faded rose print and my wide-brimmed sun hat that James had bought me for our 30th anniversary, my hands deep in the soil as I tended to my prize-winning roses. The physical act of gardening had always been my meditation, my connection to life and growth and beauty. Suddenly, I would hear the front door closing with that distinctive sound, the slight squeak of the hinges that James had never gotten around to fixing, followed by the click of the deadbolt. My heart would skip a beat, that primal fear response that humans have when they realize someone has entered their territory without permission. "Mom, you left the stove on again," David would call out, his voice carefully modulated to convey just the right amount of concern, not enough to seem alarmist, but enough to plant seeds of doubt about my competence. I would rush inside, dirt still under my fingernails, soil staining my gardening gloves, my heart racing with panic and confusion. There, sitting innocuously on the stove, would be my old copper kettle, the one James had given me for our 5th anniversary. But the burner underneath would be cold to the touch, clearly unused for hours. I could smell gas when I walked in, David would say, his brow furrowed with what appeared to be genuine worry. Thank God I came by when I did. What if you'd gone upstairs and fallen asleep? What if there had been a leak? I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't used the stove that morning. I had eaten a bowl of cold cereal and fresh blueberries for breakfast, drinking orange juice straight from the carton as I stood at the kitchen window watching the morning joggers pass by. I remembered this clearly because I had been feeling guilty about not cooking myself a proper breakfast, something James had always insisted was important for starting the day right. But David would look at me with such concerned eyes, such apparent love and fear for my safety, that I began to question my own memory. Could I have turned on the burner and forgotten? Was it possible that my mind was starting to slip in ways I hadn't noticed? These incidents became more frequent and more disturbing. Every 2 or 3 weeks, David would arrive to find evidence of my supposed cognitive decline. Lights would be on in rooms I never entered, the formal dining room that I hadn't used since James's funeral, the guest bedroom that had been closed off for years, even the basement where I rarely went except to do laundry. "Mom, you're running up your electric bill," David would say, flipping switches with the efficient movements of someone cleaning up after a careless child. "All these lights were blazing when I got here. Don't you remember turning them on?" I would stand there in my own home, feeling like a stranger, trying desperately to remember any reason why I might have gone into those rooms. But the harder I tried to remember, the more confused I became. Memory, I was learning, is a fragile thing. When you start questioning it, it becomes unreliable, slippery, impossible to trust. My personal belongings began appearing in bizarre locations that made no logical sense. My reading glasses, which I kept religiously on my bedside table, would be found in the refrigerator next to the milk carton. My house keys would turn up in the medicine cabinet behind the aspirin bottle. My purse would be discovered in the basement laundry room, sitting on top of the washing machine like I had placed it there deliberately. Each time, David would be the one to find these misplaced items, and each time, his explanation would be the same. "Mom, you must have put this here and forgotten." This is exactly how Grandpa's dementia started. He would put things in strange places and then insist someone else had moved them. This reference to my father's dementia was particularly cruel because David knew how terrified I had always been of developing the same condition. My father had died in a nursing home, confused and frightened, not recognizing his own daughter in his final months. It was my deepest, most primal fear, and David was deliberately triggering it to make me more susceptible to his manipulation. "Mom, we're worried about you," David said one gray afternoon in November as I sat at my kitchen table in my pale blue nightgown, even though it was past 2 p.m. I had been feeling increasingly fatigued, sleeping 12 or 14 hours a day and struggling to maintain my usual routines. "Mrs. Henderson from next door called. She said she saw you wandering around the backyard at 2 a.m. in your nightgown, looking confused and calling for Dad." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, feeling the familiar fog that had been creeping into my thoughts more frequently. Mrs. Henderson was my dear friend and trusted neighbor. Why would she lie about something so serious? But more disturbing was the detail about me calling for James. In my deepest grief during the months after his death, I had sometimes found myself starting to call his name before remembering he was gone. Had I really been doing this in my sleep? Was my grief and loneliness manifesting in ways that made me appear mentally unstable? "I don't remember going outside," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. I would remember something like that, wouldn't I? David's expression was perfectly calibrated, concerned but not surprised, loving but slightly fearful. "Mom, that's exactly what worries us. The fact that you can't remember these episodes. We think you might be having some kind of sleep disorder, or maybe early-stage dementia like Grandpa." The word dementia sent ice water through my veins. I could feel myself starting to panic, my breathing becoming shallow and rapid. What if he was right? What if my mind was deteriorating and I was too far gone to recognize it? When I called Mrs. Henderson later that day to apologize for disturbing her, she sounded genuinely confused. "Wandering in your backyard? Oh, honey, I never called anyone about that. I've been visiting my sister in Florida for the past 3 weeks. I just got home yesterday, but by then, David's seeds of doubt had taken root. Was Mrs. Henderson forgetting that she had made the call? Was I misremembering our conversation? Was I confusing different days or different neighbors? The uncertainty was maddening, like trying to grab hold of smoke. The phone calls began around the same time. David would be in my living room, speaking in hushed, urgent tones into his cell phone. But the moment he heard my footsteps on the creaky floorboard near the kitchen doorway, he would quickly end the call with a sharp, "I'll call you back," and slip the phone into his pocket. "Just work stuff, Mom," he would say with that practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Nothing for you to worry about. You should rest more. You look tired." But I had overheard fragments of these conversations, words that made no sense in the context of David's supposed consulting business. Timeline, spoken with urgency. Inheritance, said in a tone that made my skin crawl. Power of attorney, whispered like a secret. Facility, pronounced with clinical detachment. When I gathered the courage to ask him directly about these conversations, David's response was always the same deflection. "Mom, you're hearing things that aren't there. I think your hearing might be going, 'Have you had it checked lately?' Sometimes hearing loss can make people think they're hearing conversations that aren't happening." This was particularly insidious because I had been noticing some hearing difficulties, normal age-related changes that my doctor had mentioned during my last physical. By suggesting that my hearing loss was causing auditory hallucinations, David was taking a legitimate health concern and weaponizing it against me. Pictures began disappearing from my house in what seemed like a deliberate campaign to erase my memories and my identity. The first to vanish was the wedding photo of James and me that had sat on the mantelpiece for over 40 years. A formal studio portrait where we both looked impossibly young and hopeful, James in his navy dress uniform and me in my grandmother's lace wedding dress. That photo was sacred to me. I looked at it every morning while drinking my coffee and every evening before turning off the living room lights. It was my visual reminder that I had been loved completely, that my life had meaning and history and beauty. When I noticed it was gone, I felt like someone had reached into my chest and torn out a piece of my heart. I searched frantically. Maybe I had moved it while dusting. Maybe it had fallen behind the mantel, but it had simply vanished. "Mom, you packed it away yourself last month," David said when I called him in tears. "Don't you remember? You said you were tired of looking at sad memories, that seeing Dad's face was making your grief worse. We talked about this for over an hour. You were very definite about wanting to put away reminders of Dad. I would never, ever have said such a thing." That photograph wasn't a source of sadness. It was my lifeline to happiness, my proof that love existed and that I had experienced it. But David spoke with such certainty, such detailed recollection of our supposed conversation, that I began to doubt my own feelings about my most treasured possession. More photographs disappeared over the following weeks. Family Christmas pictures where we all looked genuinely happy. Images of David's high school graduation where he actually seemed proud to have me as his mother. Snapshots of James working in his beloved workshop with wood shavings in his hair and a satisfied smile on his face. Each missing photo was another piece of my history, my identity, my proof that I had lived a life worth remembering. Each time I noticed something was gone, David would have a plausible explanation. I had donated them to charity during a spring cleaning phase I couldn't remember. I had given them to him for safekeeping because I was worried about burglars. I had told him I wanted to declutter the house because all the memories were becoming overwhelming. But I remembered none of these conversations, none of these decisions that would have been momentous for me. Giving away family photographs would have been a deliberate emotional process, something I would have agonized over and probably regretted. It wasn't something I would have done casually or forgotten immediately afterward. My personal jewelry began vanishing from my bedroom in what felt like a systematic theft of my most intimate treasures. The gold locket James had given me for our 25th anniversary disappeared first. A heart-shaped pendant that contained tiny photos of both of us, young and smiling, that he had surprised me with over a romantic dinner at our favorite restaurant. Then my mother's pearl earrings vanished, the ones she had given me on my wedding day with tears in her eyes saying, "These were my mother's, and now they're yours, and someday they'll belong to your daughter or daughter-in-law." I had worn them every Sunday to church for 43 years, and they were supposed to go to Sarah when she and David finally had children. When I discovered they were missing, I completely fell apart. I found myself on my bedroom floor at 3 a.m., surrounded by the contents of my jewelry box, sobbing hysterically as I searched through every compartment, every velvet slot, every possible hiding place. They were simply gone, as if they had never existed. "Mom, you gave those to Sarah last month for her birthday," David said the next morning when he found me red-eyed and exhausted in my kitchen. "Remember? You said you wanted her to have something special, something with family history." Sarah was so touched she cried, but Sarah's birthday was in November and it was only August. And I would never give away my mother's earrings without a ceremony, without sitting Sarah down and telling her the stories behind them, without making it a moment of connection between generations of women in our family. Moreover, if such a meaningful gift-giving had occurred, wouldn't I remember Sarah's reaction? Wouldn't I remember the feeling of satisfaction that comes from giving someone you love a treasure from your own life? Wouldn't there be photos, or at least a warm memory of her gratitude? The rules began as gentle suggestions, but gradually became firm restrictions that limited my freedom and independence in increasingly alarming ways. David would arrive for his visits with a new concern, a new limitation that he believed was necessary for my safety and well-being. "Mom, maybe you shouldn't drive at night anymore," he said one evening as autumn was turning into winter. "Your depth perception isn't what it used to be, and with your hearing problems, you might not notice emergency vehicles." I read an article about how many accidents happen to seniors who drive after dark. I had been driving for 54 years without a single accident. I had excellent vision even without glasses, reflexes that were still sharp from years of tennis and gardening, and a clean driving record that my insurance company rewarded with reduced premiums. But David spoke with such authority, such apparent expertise about senior driving issues, that I found myself agreeing to avoid evening trips. "Mom, you really shouldn't be answering the door when you're alone," was his next restriction, delivered with the same concerned tone that had become his standard approach to controlling my behavior. There are a lot of scammers targeting elderly people these days, especially people with dementia. They can be very convincing, very manipulative. What if someone talked you into giving them money or personal information? The implication that I was too cognitively impaired to recognize a scam was deeply insulting. But by this point, I was so confused about my own mental state that I couldn't argue confidently. Maybe David was right. Maybe my judgment was compromised in ways I couldn't see. "Mom, I think it's better if you don't go grocery shopping by yourself anymore," came next, delivered as we sat in my living room while I struggled to remember what I had eaten for breakfast that morning. "You've been buying duplicates of things you already have, and I found spoiled food in your refrigerator that you forgot about. What if you bought something dangerous by mistake? What if you forgot to check expiration dates?" Each restriction was presented with logical reasoning and apparent concern for my safety, but the cumulative effect was the systematic dismantling of my independence. I was losing the ability to drive myself places, to welcome visitors, to manage my own household needs, all the basic freedoms that define adult life. But the most disturbing rule was about the basement, and it came with a level of urgency that felt different from David's other suggestions. "Promise me you won't go down to the basement anymore, Mom," he said one gray December afternoon, his hand gripping my wrist with surprising force. "The stairs are too steep, and with your balance issues, if you fell, no one would find you for hours. You could be lying there injured, calling for help, and nobody would hear you." But I had been going up and down those stairs for 43 years. First as a young wife helping James set up his workshop, later as a mother doing laundry while David played in the finished recreation room, and recently as a widow seeking comfort among James's tools and projects. The stairs were steep but sturdy, with a solid handrail that James had installed specifically for safety. More importantly, the basement was where I kept my collection of first edition novels, my photo albums, and many of James's personal papers and projects. It was also where we kept our old financial records, tax returns, and insurance documents. Why was David suddenly so concerned about this particular area of my house? When I asked him to explain his specific worry about the basement, his jaw tightened in that familiar way it had since he was a child caught in a lie. His eyes grew cold and calculating, and for just a moment, the mask of loving concern slipped enough for me to see something predatory underneath. "Because I love you, Mom, and I can't bear the thought of you getting hurt," he said, but his voice had an edge that made me shiver. "You're all I have left, and if something happened to you because I didn't protect you from your own stubbornness, I'd never forgive myself." But his eyes told a different story. His eyes were measuring, evaluating, calculating something that had nothing to do with my safety and everything to do with his own agenda. For the first time in my life, I looked at my son and wondered if he might be deliberately lying to me about something important. And once that doubt took root, I began to see other inconsistencies, other moments when his words and his expressions didn't quite match, other times when his concern felt more like control than love. Critical incident. The turning point came on a humid Tuesday evening in late September, when the air was thick with the promise of an approaching thunderstorm. The oppressive heat had been building all day, and even with the air conditioning running, the house felt stuffy and uncomfortable. I had been feeling increasingly foggy and disoriented for months, sleeping 12 to 14 hours a day and struggling to remember conversations that had happened the day before, sometimes even hours before. My days had become a blur of confusion and exhaustion. I would wake up feeling drugged, my thoughts moving through thick molasses, my limbs heavy and uncooperative. Simple tasks that had once been automatic, making coffee, reading the newspaper, tending to my roses, now required enormous effort and concentration. I would find myself standing in rooms with no memory of why I had come there, holding objects with no recollection of picking them up. David had started bringing me pre-sorted pill containers every week, arriving every Sunday afternoon with a large white plastic organizer divided into sections for each day of the week. Each compartment contained 3 pills, morning, afternoon, and evening doses, and David would spend careful time explaining the new routine my doctor had prescribed. "The doctor says these will help slow down the progression of your Alzheimer's," he explained during one of these visits, sitting at my kitchen table while I made us both chamomile tea with hands that shook slightly from fatigue. The familiar ritual of making tea was one of the few tasks I could still perform without thinking, my muscle memory taking over when my cognitive abilities failed me. "But you have to take them exactly as prescribed, at the exact times I've marked on the container," David continued, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when he wanted to make sure I understood something important. "Your brain needs consistency to heal. Missing doses or taking them at the wrong times could actually make your condition worse." The pills were small and white, completely unmarked without any identifying numbers or letters that should have been standard on legitimate prescription medications. They made me feel drowsy within an hour of taking them, and the drowsiness would deepen into a heavy, dreamless sleep that lasted far longer than was natural for someone my age. But David assured me this was normal, part of the healing process that would eventually restore my cognitive function. "Sleep is when the brain repairs itself," he would say, watching me carefully as I took each dose. "The more you sleep, the better your chances of recovery." He would sit with me every evening during the medication routine, making casual conversation about his work or Sarah's health while never taking his eyes off me. I had to open my mouth after swallowing to prove the pills were gone, like a child who might try to hide vegetables under their tongue. At the time, I thought this was just loving concern for my compliance with treatment. Now I understand it was the careful supervision of a predator ensuring his victim remained properly drugged. That Tuesday evening felt different from the beginning. The approaching storm had set my nerves on edge in a way that reminded me of the atmospheric pressure changes that used to trigger my migraines when I was younger. But more than that, there was something in David's demeanor that seemed off, more tense than his usual controlled concern. He arrived at exactly 7 p.m., as had become his routine, but instead of his usual casual clothes, he was wearing a dark suit like he had come from an important business meeting. His hair was perfectly styled, his shoes were polished, and there was a slight scent of expensive cologne that I didn't recognize. He looked like someone dressed for an occasion, not a casual check-in with his aging mother. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" he asked, setting his briefcase down by the front door with unusual care. I noticed the briefcase was new, expensive-looking leather that I had never seen before. When had David started carrying a briefcase? His consulting work had always been casual, conducted mostly from his home office via email and phone calls. "I'm tired," I admitted, which was always true these days, and confused. I couldn't remember where I put my reading glasses this morning, and I found them in the kitchen cupboard next to the sugar bowl. "I don't understand why I would have put them there." David's smile was sympathetic, but there was something calculating in his eyes, like a poker player who had just been dealt exactly the cards he needed. "The confusion is getting worse, isn't it? Dr. Patterson warned us this might happen as the disease progresses." Dr. Patterson? I had never heard that name before. My physician was Dr. Martinez. a wonderful woman who had been treating me for 8 years and who had never mentioned any signs of cognitive decline during my annual physicals. "Who is Dr. Patterson?" I asked, feeling that familiar fog descending as I tried to make sense of yet another piece of information that didn't fit with my understanding of my own medical care. "Mom, we've talked about Dr. Patterson many times. He's the neurologist who diagnosed your Alzheimer's. Remember? We went to see him together at the Millfield Medical Center. You were very upset that day because you didn't want to admit you were having memory problems." I had no recollection of visiting any neurologist, no memory of receiving an Alzheimer's diagnosis, no recollection of being upset about memory problems. But the details David provided were so specific, so convincing, that I began to doubt my own memory once again. Could I really have forgotten something as significant as being diagnosed with a devastating disease? Was my memory loss so severe that I couldn't even remember the moment my life had changed forever? "Let's get you your evening medication," David said, producing the familiar pill organizer from his briefcase. "Dr. Patterson increased the dosage last week, remember? He said we need to be more aggressive about managing your symptoms." As David handed me the evening pill with a glass of water, I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. This was unusual. David was always so controlled, so confident in his movements. His usual composed demeanor seemed forced tonight, and there was sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning running. "Take your medication, Mom," he said, his voice carrying an edge of urgency that I had never heard before. "You don't want to have another episode like last week." Episode? What episode? I didn't remember any episode, but then again, I didn't remember much of anything clearly anymore. The constant fog in my mind made it impossible to distinguish between real memories and imagined ones, between things that had actually happened and stories David told me about my own behavior. As I raised the pill to my lips, something extraordinary happened. For just a moment, the persistent fog in my mind lifted completely, like a strong wind suddenly blowing away a heavy cloud cover. In that moment of absolute clarity, every instinct I had screamed that something was terribly, dangerously wrong. This clarity was so sudden, so complete, that it felt like awakening from a drugged sleep. I could think with a sharpness I hadn't experienced in months. I could see details I had been missing, hear nuances in David's voice that revealed deception, feel the wrongness of this entire situation with perfect awareness. For the first time in my adult life, I decided not to trust my son. Instead of swallowing the pill, I tucked it carefully under my tongue, using a technique I remembered from childhood when I would try to avoid taking cough medicine. The pill was bitter and chalky, and I had to fight the urge to gag as I pretended to drink the water while keeping the medication hidden in my mouth. David watched me with laser-like focus, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he was studying my reaction more carefully than usual. I forced myself to maintain normal eye contact, to breathe steadily, to show no sign that anything had changed. "Good, Mom," he said, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. "Now let's get you settled for the night. You must be exhausted." He helped me to my bedroom with unusual solicitude, pulling the covers up to my chin like I was a small child being tucked in for the night. "Sweet dreams," he said, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "I'll check on you in the morning." But there was something different about his kiss. Something cold and perfunctory that felt more like a ritual than genuine affection. And as he turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of his expression in the mirror over my dresser. His face had transformed the moment he thought I couldn't see him. The mask of loving concern had been replaced by something calculating and cold. After David left, I listened to his car start in my driveway and waited until the sound of his engine had completely disappeared into the distance. Only then did I spit the pill into a tissue, examining it under my bedside lamp with hands that were shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. The pill was completely white and unmarked, with no identifying numbers, letters, or scoring that should have been present on any legitimate prescription medication. I had taken enough prescription drugs over the years, antibiotics, blood pressure medication, pain relievers after minor surgeries, to know that real pharmaceutical products always had identifying marks. I wrapped the pill carefully in the tissue and hid it in my jewelry box, underneath the velvet tray where I used to keep my mother's pearls before they mysteriously disappeared. For the first time in months, my mind began to clear as the hours passed. It was like watching the sunrise after the longest night of my life. Thoughts that had been muddled and confused for months suddenly became sharp and focused. Memories that had been clouded by fog suddenly snapped into clarity with photographic detail. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling with growing horror as pieces of my recent past began fitting together like a jigsaw puzzle revealing a terrifying picture. The fog that had been shrouding my mind for months wasn't a symptom of Alzheimer's disease. It was the direct result of whatever drugs David had been giving me. I remembered conversations with perfect clarity now. Conversations that David had convinced me I was misremembering or forgetting entirely. I remembered exactly where I had put my wedding photo, on the mantelpiece where it had sat for 40 years, not packed away in some forgotten box. I remembered that I had never given my mother's earrings to Sarah, never had any conversation about being tired of looking at sad memories, never agreed to declutter my house, but most importantly, I remembered that I had never, ever been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. I had never seen a Dr. Patterson, never visited a neurologist, never had any symptoms of cognitive decline until David started bringing me those unmarked white pills 8 months ago. As this realization washed over me like ice water, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins and confirmed my worst fears about what was really happening to me. Footsteps in my house. At 1:47 a.m., according to the digital clock on my bedside table, I held my breath and listened with the hyper-awareness that comes from suddenly understanding you're in mortal danger. Slow, deliberate footsteps were moving through my living room, pausing occasionally as if the intruder was examining something or looking for something specific. David was supposed to be at home with Sarah, 20 minutes away in their colonial house in Westbrook. There was no legitimate reason for anyone to be in my house in the middle of the night, but these weren't the chaotic, hurried footsteps of a burglar looking for quick valuables to steal. These were the measured, confident movements of someone who belonged here, someone who had every right to be in my house while I was unconscious, someone who expected me to be drugged into oblivion and completely unaware of his presence. The footsteps moved toward my kitchen, and I heard the distinctive sound of my basement door opening, that familiar creak of hinges that James had never gotten around to oiling. Then slow, careful footsteps descending the stairs that David had declared too dangerous for me to use due to my supposed balance problems and cognitive decline. My heart pounded so hard I was afraid the sound might carry through the house and alert the intruder to my consciousness. I forced myself to breathe slowly and silently while every muscle in my body tensed with terror. What was David doing in my basement in the middle of the night? Why was he creeping through my house like a thief when he thought I was unconscious? What was he hiding down there that he didn't want me to discover? I waited in perfect stillness for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes. During that time, I heard various sounds from the basement, something heavy being moved across the floor, what sounded like filing cabinets being opened and closed, and the distinctive sound of papers being shuffled and sorted. When the footsteps finally came back up the basement stairs, I heard the door close with exaggerated care, as if David was being extra cautious not to wake his supposedly sedated mother. Then the footsteps moved to my kitchen, and I heard my refrigerator opening and closing, followed by the sounds of cabinets being opened and searched. It sounded like someone was either hiding something or looking for something specific, moving through my kitchen with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly where everything was kept. The most chilling sound came next, my spare bedroom door opening. This was the room where I kept all my important documents, my photo albums, and family heirlooms that were too valuable or meaningful to display in the main living areas. James's military medals were in there, along with our marriage certificate, my parents' immigration papers, and boxes of family photographs dating back to my grandparents' wedding. Someone was going through my most precious possessions, my most private papers, while they thought I was helplessly drugged and unaware. The violation felt almost as devastating as a physical assault. This wasn't just theft. It was the systematic destruction of my privacy, my autonomy, my sense of safety in my own home. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the spare bedroom door close softly, followed by more movement through my living room and kitchen. Finally, after what the clock showed was nearly 2 hours of activity in my house, I heard the front door close with the same careful quiet that had characterized all of David's movements. A few minutes later, I heard a car engine starting in my driveway, not the familiar sound of David's sedan, but something different, perhaps a car with a larger engine that he had borrowed or rented for this nighttime visit. I remained perfectly still for another full hour, terrified that David might return, or that he might have an accomplice who was still somewhere in my house. Only when I was absolutely certain that I was alone did I dare to get up and investigate what had happened. My legs were shaking so badly from fear and adrenaline that I could barely stand. I made my way slowly through my house, checking every room and looking for signs of what David had been doing during his clandestine visit. In my kitchen, I found a notebook hidden behind the flour canister in my pantry, a notebook I had never seen before, bound in black leather and filled with David's familiar handwriting. As I opened it and began to read by the light of my kitchen window, the full scope of his betrayal began to reveal itself in the most horrifying detail imaginable. Day 127. Subject slept 14 hours. No resistance to evening medication. Memory gaps increasing as planned. Ready to proceed to Phase 2. Day 143. Increased evening dosage. Subject questioned missing photos but accepted explanation. Financial documents located in bedroom closet. Day 156. Subject's confusion levels optimal. Mrs. Henderson returning from Florida next week. Need to maintain story about wandering incident. Page after page of observations about me, written like I was a laboratory animal rather than his mother. And at the very back of the notebook, a phone number with a note. Shady Oaks Memory Care. Deposit required, $25,000. I sank into my kitchen chair, still wearing my nightgown, as the horrible truth crashed over me like a tsunami. Major revelation. The notebook I found hidden behind the flour canister in my pantry contained the most devastating evidence of betrayal I could ever have imagined. As I sat at my kitchen table in the pale light of dawn, reading page after page of David's methodical documentation, I felt my entire understanding of reality crumble around me like a house of cards. The notebook was organized with the precision of a clinical researcher conducting an experiment on a laboratory animal. Each page was dated, with detailed observations about my behavior, my responses to the medication, and the progressive success of what David called cognitive deterioration management. Day 1, September 15th. Initial lorazepam dose, 2 mg, administered successfully. Subject complained of unusual tiredness but showed no suspicion. Established cover story about new vitamins prescribed by family doctor. Next step, increase social isolation by limiting outside contact. Day 12, September 26th. Dosage increased to 3 mg. Subject sleeping 11-12 hours per day. Memory formation appears significantly impaired. Introduced false memories about leaving stove on and misplacing items. Subject beginning to question own competence. Day 27, October 11th. Subject fully responsive to environmental manipulation. Successfully convinced her she gave away wedding photo voluntarily. Note, consider increasing evening dose to 4 mg to deepen confusion during peak vulnerability hours. Day 45, October 29th. Major breakthrough. Subject now accepts false narratives about Mrs. Henderson's phone call and wandering episodes. Cognitive baseline assessment shows 60% decline from normal function. Ready to introduce fake medical diagnosis. Page after page revealed the systematic destruction of my mind, documented with the clinical detachment of someone conducting a scientific experiment. David had been tracking my sleep patterns, my eating habits, my social interactions, and my emotional responses to his manipulation with the thoroughness of a professional researcher. But the most chilling entries dealt with his long-term planning and the ultimate goal of his systematic abuse. Day 78, December 1st. Subject's confusion levels optimal for Phase 2 implementation. Contacted Shady Oaks Memory Care Facility. Initial deposit of $25,000 required for secured admission. Timeline, complete financial transfer by February, facility placement by March. Day 95, December 18th. Power of attorney documents prepared. Forged signature practice sessions completed successfully. Note, Sarah becoming suspicious of subject's rapid decline, need to limit her access during final phases. Day 127, January 19th. Financial transfers proceeding on schedule. $47,000 successfully moved to offshore accounts. Subject's house appraisal completed under guise of insurance evaluation. Estimated value, $420,000. Total projected inheritance, $680,000 plus property. Day 156, February 17th. Subject's cognitive function deteriorating faster than expected. May need to accelerate timeline. Mrs. Henderson returning from Florida next week. Maintain story about wandering incident to justify facility placement if questioned. The clinical language David used to describe my destruction was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the entire journal. He referred to me as the subject throughout, never as mom or mother, or even by my name. I had been reduced to a test subject in his mind, a problem to be solved rather than a human being who had given him life and love. But the notebook was just the beginning of my discoveries. With my mind finally clear for the first time in months, I went to my bedroom closet and searched for the documents David had mentioned in his notes. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I found the folder where I kept important papers, my will, insurance policies, bank statements, and the deed to my house. Everything was there, but it was immediately obvious that someone had been going through these documents extensively. Papers were in the wrong order, and some had small pencil marks in the margins that looked like someone had been making calculations or notes. As I examined my most recent bank statements, documents I hadn't looked at in months due to my supposed confusion, I discovered financial devastation that took my breath away. Over the past 6 months, $87,000 had been systematically stolen from my savings account. The withdrawals had been made in amounts ranging from $8,000 to $15,000 each, carefully structured to avoid triggering automatic bank alerts for large transactions. All of the withdrawals were signed with my name, but as I compared the signatures to my actual handwriting, I could see they were forgeries. The fake signatures were skillful, but not perfect. My real signature had developed certain quirks over decades, the way I looped the G in Margaret, the slight slant to my letters from years of writing left-handed, the tiny pause I always made between my first and last name. The forged signatures were close enough to fool a casual observer, but lacked these personal characteristics that made my handwriting unique. But David had been practicing. At the bottom of the folder, I found several sheets of paper covered with attempts at copying my signature, each one getting progressively more accurate. He had been studying my handwriting the way an art forger studies a master's technique, perfecting his ability to steal my identity one signature at a time. I found copies of documents I had never signed, including a power of attorney form that would give David complete control over my finances, my medical decisions, and my legal affairs. According to the date on the form, I had supposedly signed it 7 weeks ago during one of my confused periods when I was allegedly unable to understand complex decisions. The power of attorney document was notarized by someone named Robert Mills, with an official seal and signature that looked completely legitimate. But I had never met any Robert Mills, never sat in a notary's office signing legal documents. David had somehow arranged for fraudulent notarization, probably by having an accomplice pose as me while I was heavily sedated at home. With this power of attorney in effect, David would have had the legal right to sell my house, access my bank accounts, make medical decisions on my behalf, and commit me to a care facility against my will. I would have become a non-person in the eyes of the law, existing only as David's financial dependent. But the most devastating discovery was still to come. Hidden at the very back of my document folder was a letter from Shady Oaks Memory Care Facility that made my blood run cold and confirmed the full scope of David's plan. "Dear Mr. Caldwell," the letter began, "thank you for your recent visit and for choosing Shady Oaks Memory Care for your mother's long-term care needs. We are pleased to confirm Mrs. Margaret Caldwell's admission for October 15th, as discussed during your facility tour." October 15th was exactly 1 week away. The letter went on to detail the facility's policies for patients with advanced dementia and aggressive behavioral issues. Visitors would be limited to immediate family members only, and all visits would be supervised by medical staff. Patients were not permitted to have personal cell phones, computers, or any unsupervised contact with the outside world. "As you requested," the letter continued, "Mrs. Caldwell will be placed in our secure wing, which is specifically designed for patients with severe cognitive impairment who pose a flight risk or who might become confused and attempt to leave the facility. The secure wing is equipped with electronic monitoring and 24-hour supervision to ensure patient safety. The secure wing, electronic monitoring, no outside contact. David had arranged for me to be locked away in what amounted to a medical prison, where no one would be able to reach me or hear my protests that I had been kidnapped and drugged. I imagined myself in that facility, trying to convince nurses and doctors that I wasn't actually suffering from dementia, that my own son had been drugging me and forging documents. Who would believe such a story? I would sound like exactly what David had spent months making me appear to be, a confused, paranoid, elderly woman with advanced Alzheimer's disease. The letter also mentioned the financial arrangements David had made. The facility required a substantial upfront payment, plus monthly fees totaling nearly $8,000 per month. David had arranged for these payments to be made automatically from my bank accounts, ensuring that my life savings would be drained to pay for my own imprisonment. But perhaps the most chilling detail was a handwritten note at the bottom of the letter, signed by the facility's administrator. Per your request, Mrs. Caldwell's medication regimen will continue unchanged. Our medical staff will ensure she receives her evening sedatives as prescribed to manage her anxiety and confusion. David had convinced the facility that I required heavy sedation for behavioral management. I would arrive at Shady Oaks already drugged and would continue to be drugged throughout my stay, ensuring that I remained compliant and unable to advocate for myself. As I sat in my kitchen holding this letter, surrounded by the evidence of my son's systematic betrayal, I finally understood the full scope of what had been done to me and what was still planned for my future. David hadn't been trying to help me manage a degenerative disease. He had been systematically destroying my mind with drugs while stealing my money and planning to have me locked away forever. In 7 days, I was scheduled to disappear from the world, declared legally incompetent and confined to a medical facility where I would be kept drugged and isolated until I died. The pills I had been taking weren't medication for Alzheimer's disease. They were lorazepam, a powerful sedative that in high doses could cause exactly the symptoms I had been experiencing: memory loss, confusion, excessive sleeping, disorientation, and cognitive impairment that perfectly mimicked dementia. David had been poisoning me for 8 months, creating the very symptoms that would justify having me committed to a memory care facility. He had been gaslighting me, making me doubt my own perceptions and memories while he systematically stripped away my independence, my dignity, and my freedom. The photos that had disappeared from my house hadn't been packed away or given to charity. David had stolen them to erase evidence of my real personality and cognitive abilities. If anyone came looking for me after I was committed, they would find a house that looked like it belonged to someone with severe dementia, with no evidence of the sharp, independent woman I had been just months before. My missing jewelry and personal items had been sold to fund David's lifestyle and to pay for the deposits and fees required by the memory care facility. He had literally been trading my treasures, my connections to my past and my identity, for the money needed to imprison me. The forged documents, the fake medical diagnoses, the isolation from friends and neighbors, the restrictions on my activities, everything had been carefully orchestrated to create a legal and social framework that would allow David to steal my entire life without anyone questioning his authority or my supposed incapacity. I thought about all the times David had looked at me with fake concern in his eyes, all the times he had held my hand and promised to take care of me, all the times he had told me he loved me while actively destroying everything that made me who I was. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have, but perhaps the most devastating realization was understanding how close he had come to succeeding. In 7 days, I would have been sedated, transported to Shady Oaks, and locked away in their secure wing. David would have gained complete control over my finances and my property. My house would have been sold, my possessions distributed or discarded, and I would have effectively ceased to exist as an independent human being. No one would have believed my claims that I had been drugged and manipulated. After all, I was just a confused old woman with Alzheimer's disease, and David was my loving son who had sacrificed so much to care for me. The perfect crime, executed with patience and precision over many months. As dawn light began to filter through my kitchen windows, I sat surrounded by the evidence of the most profound betrayal imaginable. My own child, the baby I had carried, the boy I had raised, the man I had supported and defended and loved unconditionally for 44 years, had spent 8 months methodically destroying my mind and planning to steal my life. The grief was so overwhelming that I couldn't breathe. I sat at my kitchen table, still in my nightgown, sobbing with a pain that felt like it might literally tear me apart. This wasn't just about money or even attempted imprisonment. This was about the complete annihilation of everything I thought I knew about love, family, and human decency. I had lost my son twice, first to whatever sociopathic transformation had turned him into a predator, and now to the knowledge that the loving child I remembered had probably never existed at all. The David who had smiled at me while systematically destroying me was the real David, and the son I thought I had raised had been nothing more than a mask he wore when he needed something from me. But as the sun rose fully and my tears finally stopped, I realized that I wasn't powerless anymore. For the first time in 8 months, my mind was clear, my memory was sharp, and I understood exactly what was happening to me. David's plan had one fatal flaw. It required me to remain drugged and compliant, but now I was awake, aware, and angry in a way that would fuel the fight of my life. I wasn't going to disappear quietly into David's carefully planned prison. I was going to expose him, stop him, and make sure he could never do this to anyone else. The war for my life and freedom was about to begin. Second, CTA. Please subscribe. If this story is making your heart race, please hit that subscribe button right now. What I'm about to tell you next will shock you even more, and you need to hear how this ends. Ring that notification bell because everyone needs to know how predators like this operate. Maximum pain point. The next 3 days were the darkest of my entire life. I continued to pretend to take the pills, hiding them and maintaining the facade of confusion whenever David visited. But inside, I was crumbling. I would sit in my living room, staring at the empty space where my wedding photo used to be, and feel such profound grief that I couldn't eat or sleep. This wasn't just about the money, or even the attempted theft of my freedom. This was about the complete annihilation of everything I thought I knew about my son and my family. I had carried this child for 9 months, felt him kick inside me during sleepless nights. I had rocked him through countless fevers, celebrated every milestone, defended him when teachers said he was manipulative, supported him through every failure and disappointment. I had given him my unconditional love for 44 years, and he had spent the last 8 months methodically destroying me from the inside out. I found myself questioning every memory I had of David's childhood and adulthood. Had he always been capable of this level of cruelty, and I had simply refused to see it? Had there been signs I had ignored because I couldn't bear to admit that my only child was a sociopath? The isolation was almost unbearable. I couldn't call the police without proof, and even with David's notebook, I worried they wouldn't believe me. After all, I was a 72-year-old woman who had supposedly been suffering from dementia for months. David could easily claim that I was having a paranoid delusion, that I had written the notebook myself during a confused episode. I couldn't call any friends because David had gradually isolated me from them over the past year. Every time someone had invited me to lunch or called to check on me, David would intercept and explain that I was having a difficult time and needed to rest. Eventually, people stopped calling. I couldn't even trust my own daughter-in-law. Sarah had seemed genuinely kind, but she had also been present during many of David's visits. Had she known what he was doing? Had she been complicit in this plan? Or was she another one of David's victims? The worst moments were when I would catch myself in the mirror and see a stranger looking back at me. My face was gaunt from months of sleeping too much and eating too little. My hair was thin and gray, unwashed and unkempt. My eyes looked hollow, defeated, like those of a woman who had given up on life. This was what David's drugs had done to me physically, but the emotional damage was even worse. I felt like I no longer knew who I was or where I belonged in the world. If my own son could do this to me, if I had been so blind to his true nature for so many years, what else had I been wrong about? Could I trust my own judgment about anything? I spent hours sitting in James's workshop in the basement, surrounded by his tools and half-finished projects, sobbing until I had no tears left. I talked to him as if he were still alive, asking him how I had failed so completely as a mother, that our child had grown up to be capable of such calculated evil. "James, I don't know what to do," I whispered to his empty chair. "I don't know who to trust. I don't even know if I'm strong enough to fight this. Maybe it would be easier to just let him win." The thought of giving up felt almost peaceful. I could take the pills, let the fog return, and drift away into the oblivion David had planned for me. At least then I wouldn't have to face the pain of this betrayal every waking moment. But every time I considered surrender, I would think about other elderly people who might be going through the same thing. How many other children were systematically drugging and manipulating their aging parents? How many other families were being destroyed by greed and sociopathy disguised as concern? I realized that if I gave up, I wouldn't just be abandoning myself. I would be abandoning every other potential victim who needed someone to speak out against this kind of abuse. Surprising Allie. On the fourth day after my discovery, while I was sitting in my kitchen trying to figure out how to get help without ending up in a psychiatric facility myself, someone knocked on my front door. I almost didn't answer it. David had trained me not to open the door for strangers, and my confidence in my own judgment was still shattered. But something about the knock was gentle, patient, not demanding or aggressive. When I finally opened the door, I found a woman about 40 years old with kind brown eyes and graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was wearing scrubs and carrying a medical bag. "Mrs. Caldwell, my name is Rosa Martinez. I'm a nurse practitioner with Elder Care Services. I received a call from someone who was concerned about your welfare." My heart stopped. Had David found out that I had stopped taking the pills? Was this part of his plan to have me declared incompetent? Rosa must have seen the fear in my eyes because she immediately held up her hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm not here to take you anywhere or to force any treatment on you. Someone who cares about you asked me to check on you because they were worried about some changes they'd noticed in your behavior and living situation." "Who called you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Caldwell, your daughter-in-law. She said she's been trying to reach you for weeks, but your son told her you were too sick to see visitors. She was concerned because that didn't sound like the Margaret she knew." Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I had to grab the doorframe to keep from collapsing. Sarah hadn't been part of David's plan. She had been trying to help me. I invited Rosa inside and, for the first time in months, told someone the complete truth about what had been happening to me. I showed her David's notebook, the forged documents, and the pills I had hidden in my jewelry box. Rosa listened without interruption, taking notes and photographing the evidence with my permission. When I finished my story, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Caldwell, I've been working with elderly patients for 15 years, and what you're describing is called elder abuse. It's more common than most people realize, and unfortunately, it's often perpetrated by family members who have access to their victims' homes and finances." She examined the pills I had been hiding and immediately recognized them as lorazepam, a powerful sedative that could cause exactly the symptoms I had been experiencing: memory loss, confusion, excessive sleeping, and disorientation. These pills, taken in the doses you were probably receiving, would absolutely cause cognitive impairment that could mimic dementia. The fact that you're clear-headed now, just days after stopping them, proves that you never had Alzheimer's disease. Rosa helped me contact Dr. Martinez, my actual physician, who confirmed that she had never diagnosed me with any form of dementia and had never prescribed any medication for cognitive decline. Dr. Martinez was horrified when Rosa explained what had been happening and immediately scheduled an emergency appointment to document my true health status. But Rosa's most important contribution was connecting me with Detective Linda Park, a specialist in financial crimes against the elderly. Detective Park had seen cases like mine before and knew exactly how to build a case against David that would hold up in court. "The notebook is incredibly valuable evidence," Detective Park explained during our first meeting. "Most perpetrators of this type of crime are careful not to leave written records. The fact that your son documented his actions shows a level of arrogance that will work in our favor." Rosa also connected me with Sarah, who broke down crying when she saw me in person for the first time in months. "I knew something was wrong," Sarah said, holding my hands as we sat in my living room. "David told me you were deteriorating rapidly and that you had asked not to see me because it was too confusing for you. But that didn't sound like you at all. When I tried to call you directly, David said you had become paranoid and that phone calls upset you." Sarah had been conducting her own investigation, trying to understand why David suddenly had access to large amounts of cash and why he had been asking her questions about power of attorney and inheritance laws. She had found brochures for memory care facilities hidden in his car and had overheard him on the phone discussing timeline acceleration. "I was afraid I was imagining things," Sarah confessed. "David can be so convincing when he wants to be. He made me feel like I was being paranoid and jealous, but something in my gut told me to keep paying attention." Sarah had been the one to contact elder care services, risking her marriage to potentially save my life. Her courage in speaking up had literally rescued me from disappearing into David's carefully planned prison. For the first time in months, I didn't feel completely alone in the world. I had allies, people who believed me, who understood what had happened, and who were willing to help me fight back. Rebuild plus justice, plus closure. Building the case against David took 3 weeks, but Detective Park was thorough and methodical. She worked with the bank to trace the forged signatures and unauthorized withdrawals, contacted Shady Oaks Memory Care to document the fraudulent admission arrangements, and arranged for the pills I had been given to be tested by a laboratory. Rosa helped me detox safely from the sedatives and worked with Dr. Martinez to document the improvement in my cognitive function as the drugs left my system. Within 2 weeks, I was sleeping normal hours, thinking clearly, and feeling like myself for the first time in months. The hardest part was accepting that I would have to face David in court, and that our relationship, as twisted as it had become, was over forever. Part of me still wanted to believe that my son could be redeemed, that there was some explanation for his actions that would allow us to rebuild our family. But Detective Park helped me understand that David's behavior showed clear signs of antisocial personality disorder, a condition that made him incapable of genuine empathy or remorse. He didn't drug you because he was desperate or confused, she explained. He did it because he wanted your money and saw you as an obstacle to be removed. People like that don't change, Mrs. Caldwell. They just get better at hiding what they are. When the police arrested David at his home, Sarah called to tell me that he had shown no emotion except anger at being caught. He hadn't asked about my welfare or expressed any concern about the damage he had done to my health and well-being. His only questions were about whether he could make bail and how much legal representation was going to cost. He looked at me like I was a traitor, Sarah said, her voice shaking, like I was the one who had done something wrong by exposing him. There wasn't even a moment of shame or regret. The trial lasted 4 days. David's defense attorney tried to portray me as a confused elderly woman who had invented an elaborate delusion to explain her own cognitive decline. But the evidence was overwhelming. The notebook in David's handwriting, the forged signatures on bank documents, the sedatives found in his possession, and the testimony from medical experts about the effects of long-term lorazepam abuse. The most powerful moment came when I took the witness stand to tell my story in my own words. I had been terrified that I would break down or that David's presence in the courtroom would intimidate me into silence. But when I looked at him sitting at the defendant's table, I felt no love, no fear, only a cold determination to make sure he could never do this to anyone else. I gave this man life, I said, looking directly at the jury. I raised him, loved him, and supported him for 44 years, and he repaid me by systematically destroying my mind and stealing my freedom. If he could do this to his own mother, he is capable of doing it to anyone. David was convicted on multiple charges: elder abuse, fraud, forgery, theft, and attempted kidnapping. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution plus damages. The judge specifically noted that David had shown no remorse and represented a continuing danger to elderly people. But the real justice came from the changes that followed the trial. Detective Park used David's case to train other law enforcement officers on recognizing signs of pharmaceutical elder abuse. Rosa developed new protocols for elder care services to identify victims of family-perpetrated drug abuse, and I became a speaker for elder rights organizations, sharing my story to help other families recognize and prevent this type of crime. Sarah and I rebuilt our relationship, and she became the daughter I had always wanted. She helped me restore my house, replacing the photos David had stolen and creating new memories to overlay the traumatic ones. We planted a new section in my rose garden, which we dedicated to James's memory and to all the elderly people who had been victimized by their own families. Third CTA, please subscribe. Please hit that subscribe button and share this story with everyone you know. Elder abuse is happening in families everywhere, and awareness is the only way to stop it. Ring that bell for notifications because stories like this save lives. 6 months after David's conviction, I received a letter from a woman in Oregon whose son had been drugging her with sleeping pills while systematically draining her retirement account. She had seen a news story about my case and recognized the pattern of behavior. Because of the awareness my story had generated, she was able to get help before losing her home and her freedom. That letter sits framed on my kitchen table next to a new photo of James and me, a reminder that even the most devastating betrayals can be transformed into something that helps others. I'm 73 years old now, completely independent again, and sharper mentally than I was before this ordeal began. I drive myself to the grocery store twice a week, tend to my award-winning roses, and volunteer at the library every Thursday afternoon. I also speak at conferences across the country, teaching people how to recognize the warning signs of pharmaceutical elder abuse. My relationship with David is over forever, and I've made peace with that loss. I've learned that being a good mother doesn't mean accepting abuse from your children, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold people accountable for their actions, even when it breaks your heart. The most important lesson I want to share is this: trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, even if you can't explain why, especially if it involves someone you love trying to take control of your life for your own good, get a second opinion. Talk to someone outside your immediate family. Don't let anyone convince you that your concerns are just symptoms of age or confusion. And if you have elderly parents or relatives, pay attention to sudden changes in their behavior, cognition, or living situations. Ask questions. Visit unannounced sometimes. Make sure they're still connected to friends and activities they've always enjoyed. Elder abuse thrives in isolation, and your awareness could save someone's life. I still miss the son I thought I had, the loving child I believed I had raised, but I don't miss the man he actually became, the cold, calculating predator who saw his own mother as nothing more than a financial opportunity. Today, I'm surrounded by people who genuinely care about me. Rosa, who still checks on me monthly, Detective Park, who has become a friend, Sarah, who visits every Sunday for tea and homemade cookies, and the dozens of elder abuse survivors I've met through my advocacy work. We've created a chosen family based on respect, honesty, and genuine care. Everything my biological family should have been but never was. My house still smells of lavender and vanilla candles. The cardinals still sing in the oak tree every morning, and I still read in my favorite armchair every evening, now with complete clarity of mind and the satisfaction of knowing that I fought back against someone who tried to destroy me and won. If you're watching this and you recognize any part of my story in your own life or in the life of someone you love, please don't stay silent. Speak up, ask for help, and remember that you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of your age. No one, not even your own children, has the right to take away your freedom, your possessions, or your sense of self. Fight back, because you're worth fighting for. And remember, the pills that were supposed to help my Alzheimer's were actually destroying my mind. But the most powerful medication I ever took was the truth. The truth set me free, brought me justice, and gave my life new purpose. Don't ever let anyone convince you to give up your right to the truth, no matter how much they claim to love you. Thank you for listening to my story, and please share it with everyone you know. Together, we can make sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else.